Hello, you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. Welcome to the program that introduces you to believers in Jesus living in Israel and the West Bank today, Jews, Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. Today we continue with the story of Eitan Shishkoff. I met him in Haifa recently where we recorded this interview. He and his wife left the comfort of the United States and came to live in Israel in 1992, having left a hippie lifestyle when they discovered that Jesus, or Yeshua, was their Messiah. I started by asking Eitan, did he know what he would be doing when he arrived in Israel?
The only thing that I knew was that while I was still in the States, that God had shown me a picture, a vision, if you will, during prayer, of an oasis in the desert. And this oasis, I received explanation from God's Spirit, represented a center that God wanted to actually create in Israel. I knew that the setting was Israel. And the oasis represented a place of refreshing, of healing, of equipping, and then of sending out again, all of which has come to pass. But I didn't know what form that would take. And so that vision came in 89. It was not until early 95 that I began to pray with some other people concerning God's plans, God's intention for the immigrants. At that time, there were hundreds of thousands. Eventually, it was 1.25 million Jewish people came back from the former Soviet Union to Israel. Now, you have to realize that was in addition to the about 5 million Jewish residents of Israel at the time. So it represents now virtually 20% of the Jewish population of Israel, which would be a social revolution in any country, and it really has been here. But back to this picture that I brought with me to Israel, didn't know how it would be fulfilled, and then in waiting upon God in prayer, I was directed to the book of Acts, and I realized that any humanitarian aid, which was a significant part of what God had shown me in these tents in the desert. Actually, I saw a flap pulled back and saw stacks and stacks of clothes and furniture and food, things to help people coming back to the land, which the people from the former Soviet Union, Ethiopia, and other places would not be coming back with big, huge trailers of things. I mean, my possessions were shipped here on a boat, a 40-foot long trailer full of furniture and things we'd accumulated over our years. That was not the case. People would come back with these little nylon bags, the only possessions they could bring on this huge move to a whole nother country. So I realized from the book of Acts that the humanitarian aid of that era flowed out of community. And so he felt drawn to begin a simple community. It actually began in several homes. We had home Bible studies. I was teaching them in very broken Hebrew, terrible Hebrew. I'm not even impressed with my Hebrew now, all these years later, but it was awful. But I was working with other immigrants for the most part, and they were patient. And out of those early Bible studies, we rented a warehouse in an industrial area, a very out-of-the-way place, and began what became Tents of Mercy.
Now, just describe what Tents of Mercy means today. What's going on?
Well, we still have much more to experience of the restoration of what God was doing in the first century, which I believe is that's our assignment and goal. It's God's intention, as he says. But now I believe that we can see some significant elements of that have come to pass. For one thing, those few Bible studies turned into an actual congregation with regular meeting times, public meeting times, as well as continuation of home meetings. In addition to that, we started with several little boxes of used clothing to give away, and that has turned into a large warehouse facility in Kiryat Yam, amazingly just across the driveway from the very first facility that we started in. And another element in the book of Acts that we didn't really choose but came upon us was persecution, because that first facility was firebombed 2 years after we started, which was an important gut check, if you will, and also a turning point, because from that, people began from around the world to pray for us, to send in donations that we didn't ask for, and we were able to then buy a small portion of the building that was brand new. It was just being built, and which now has become our building with the warehouses that I'm mentioning. And so we saw a congregation born with Yeshua being central, celebrating our Torah heritage, receiving both Jews and Gentiles into one congregation, being a light in Israel, distributing humanitarian aid. And then something that I feel is very, very essential in that apostolic style of faith, if you will, is sending out teams to start new congregations. And so right now, as you're interviewing me, we're actually sitting in the facility of a daughter congregation, and we've seen 4 more congregations born. So there's now a beautiful little interrelated network of 5 congregations here in the Galilee.
You mentioned that not just Jewish people go to your congregations, but also Gentiles. Who are they? What's their background?
Well, some of them are the product of intermarriage within families, which is extremely common, especially in the former Soviet Union, but also in other portions of the Jewish world, particularly in the 20th and 21st century. And then, of course, there are volunteers, there are people who live here in various capacities who are not born Jewish, as well as people who come from abroad. And although we might not say that they're week-to-week members of the congregation, but we receive people from the nations really as full brothers and sisters, as partners in what God is wanting to do in Israel today.
Now that leads us very neatly into talking about a book you've just published. It's called What About Us? The End Time Calling of Gentiles in Israel's Revival. So Gentiles are therefore as important as the Jewish people in God's end time plan.
Well said. I agree. I believe that we will not see the return of Yeshua, the Messiah, without each other. In other words, God has rigged this. He's fixed to fix the fix, as they say. And so without the Jewish people in a strong remnant returning to faith in Yeshua, as Paul says in Romans 11, the Messiah will not return. Yeshua himself said, "You will not see me again until you," meaning the Jewish residents, he was then speaking in Jerusalem, say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord," quoting Psalm 118. And then from the other side, without the Gentile participation, as I've sought to show in this book, the resurrection, the restoration of Israel will be incomplete, and God calls upon his Gentile followers to link up in covenant friendship with their Jewish brothers and sisters in order to complete this restoration.
Now, a lot of our listeners at this point will be rolling their eyes and saying, "Oh no, why have we got to bother about Israel and the Jewish people? What's it got to do with us?" What would you say to them?
Well, it's a very profound and relevant question. The simplest answer that I can think of is that God has made an eternal covenant promise to the physical seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so God's own reputation rests upon the continuation of the people of Israel. In fact, in the very context, only a few verses after the prophecy of the New Testament, which appears in Jeremiah 31 originally, and then is quoted in the book of Hebrews, God says, "Only if the sun, moon, and stars go out of business will the seed of Israel fail to continue before me." And then he even ratifies it more, and he says, "Only if the extent of the heavens above and the depths of the earth below can be arrived at, can be searched out, will Israel cease to be a people before me." In the book of Hosea chapter 2, he says, "I have betrothed you to me forever." And of course, taking the scripture in its plain sense, in its literal meaning, that's very clear that no matter what Israel does, and he says this in many places, God will still be faithful, and he will find a way to fulfill his own word and his promises to Israel. So getting back to your question, why should it matter? Why should we bother? Isn't this extraneous? Well, it's not extraneous at all. Yeshua didn't think it was extraneous in the Gospels. Paul didn't think it was extraneous in the epistles. And even in the book of Revelation, there's mention of 144,000 Jews from the 12 tribes. There's something about the plan of God, Julia, that will not leave the people of Israel out of the picture. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody has a born of the Spirit, redeemed relationship with God just because of their physical birth. There is no such thing. It is only through faith in Yeshua, through his finished work on the cross, that any of us can become a son or daughter of God. However, God chose the Jewish people not because we were better. In fact, he says in Deuteronomy, you were a smaller people, and I didn't choose you because you were better than anybody else. So that's something we kind of have to take care of, because in all of us, there is a tendency toward jealousy. In all of us, there's a tendency to say, well, hey, why not me? And that's why I called the book, What About Us? And so I seek to answer that question through the scriptures by saying, no, God in no way has left the nations out of this picture. They are just as essential, and God's work in humanity well predates Abraham. Abraham only becomes the carrier of this special calling in chapter 12 of Genesis. There's a whole lot that happens up until that time. And so it's very important for us not to be jealous of each other. However, to have a desire for one another. And this is why Paul says in Romans 9, he says, I'd be willing to trade my own salvation, my eternal standing before God, if it were for the sake of redeeming Israel, my people. So if Paul himself has not separated himself from the Jewish people or his heritage, and he's willing to trade his eternal salvation, I think that's a very strong clue to all the rest of us, whether we're Jewish or Gentile.
Eitan Shishkoff sharing his story. And the book he has written is called What About Us? And is available from Amazon. And you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. The Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish believers and Arab Christians living in Israel and the wider Middle East. If you would like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, please either visit our website, olivetreefund.org, or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. I'll be back at the same time next week with another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.